The summer of 1914 did not just mark the beginning of a war. It marked the start of a global catastrophe that would claim over 16 million lives and change the world forever. But the spark that lit this inferno wasn't as simple as a single assassination in Sarajevo. Behind that trigger lay years of rivalries, secret deals, military buildups, and political arrogance. Today, we peel back the layers of history to uncover the real forces that dragged the world into the Great War. The powder keg of Europe. In the decades before 1914, Europe was like a room filled with dry gunpowder, just waiting for a spark. The great powers had built empires across the globe, competing for colonies, resources, and prestige. Every move one nation made was seen as a direct challenge to another. Tensions were high, trust was low, and military alliances were tightening like a noose. At the heart of this dangerous balance were two massive alliance systems: the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. These pacts were meant to protect peace, but instead guaranteed that any conflict could spiral into a continental war. One nation's quarrel could easily drag in the others. It was like a web of dominoes, ready to topple at the slightest push. The Balkans, in particular, became a hotspot of instability. The Ottoman Empire's decline left a vacuum in southeastern Europe, and both Austria-Hungary and Russia wanted to fill it. Nationalist movements were exploding, with Slavic groups yearning for independence and unity. This made the region a geopolitical tinderbox. By the early 20th century, military leaders in every major power had drawn up detailed war plans. Politicians and generals alike began to believe that war was inevitable, even desirable. All it would take now was a single event to turn plans into reality. The rise of nationalism. Nationalism was the fuel that fed the fire. Across Europe, people felt intense pride in their nations and cultures, often at the expense of others. In Germany, this nationalism was tied to a new and ambitious empire, eager to prove itself on the world stage. In France, it was a burning desire to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, lost to Germany in 1871. In Austria-Hungary, nationalism was both a tool and a threat. The empire was a patchwork of ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, and Serbs, all with different loyalties. Austrian leaders feared that nationalist movements, especially among the Slavs, could tear the empire apart. This fear shaped every foreign policy decision they made. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples, especially in the Balkans. Pan-Slavism, the idea of uniting all Slavic nations, gave Russia both a moral cause and a political excuse to interfere in the region. This put it on a collision course with Austria-Hungary. The problem with nationalism was that it made compromise nearly impossible. Nations were not only defending their borders, but also their pride, identity, and sense of destiny. In this climate, even small disputes could escalate into existential struggles. Imperial rivalries. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the age of imperialism, and the great powers were locked in a global competition. Britain, with the world's largest empire, guarded its dominance fiercely. France, still stinging from defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, sought overseas territories to restore its prestige. Germany arrived late to the imperial race, but pursued colonies with aggressive determination. Kaiser Wilhelm II's vision of Weltpolitik, world politics, aimed to make Germany a global power. This expansionism brought Berlin into conflict with both Britain and France, especially in Africa. The Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911 were prime examples of imperial rivalry fueling European tensions. Germany's interference in Morocco was seen as a direct challenge to French influence. Instead of breaking the Franco-British alliance, it only strengthened it. Germany, feeling isolated, became even more determined to assert itself. Imperial rivalries were not just about territory. They were about prestige. Every colonial dispute was a test of strength. Losing face could be as damaging as losing land, and no great power was willing to back down. This mentality pushed Europe closer to confrontation. The arms race. In the years before World War I, Europe experienced an unprecedented arms race. Nations poured vast resources into building bigger armies, faster mobilization systems, and advanced weaponry. The idea was simple. If you could mobilize first, you could win quickly. Germany's military planning revolved around the Schlieffen Plan, a lightning strike against France through Belgium, designed to knock out one opponent before the other could react. France fortified its borders, while Russia invested in expanding its rail networks to move troops faster. At sea, Britain and Germany were locked in a naval race. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 revolutionized battleship design, and both countries scrambled to build fleets of these massive warships. The arms race created a dangerous paradox. The more weapons nations built to deter war, the more confident they became in their ability to win one. Military solutions began to overshadow diplomatic ones, and the line between defense and aggression blurred. The web of alliances. The Europe of 1914 was bound together by an intricate web of alliances, each promising mutual defense, but also guaranteeing mutual destruction. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy stood opposite the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia, like two massive tectonic plates poised to collide. Every regional dispute now had the potential to ignite a continental inferno, as each side was obligated to defend the other. Politicians believed these alliances would act as a deterrent, ensuring no nation would dare attack another for fear of collective retaliation. Yet, human history shows that deterrence is fragile when pride, fear, and ambition are at stake. Once one nation moved, the others felt compelled to follow, setting in motion a chain reaction. In the summer of 1914, this network transformed a Balkan assassination into a global calamity. The alliances that once whispered peace now shouted war. The people of Europe largely had little idea of the exact nature of these commitments. Ordinary citizens believed their countries were secure, their armies unmatched, their governments wise. But the secret terms and military plans locked away in government vaults told another story, one of inevitable confrontation. When the dominoes began to fall, the public would be dragged into a war they neither understood nor desired. The diplomats who had stitched this web together were blind to its ultimate consequences. A single shot fired in Sarajevo was enough to send telegrams racing across Europe, summoning armies and sealing destinies. The rise of militarism was more than policy. It was a culture that gripped Europe in the early 20th century. Governments poured resources into expanding armies and navies, not as a precaution, but as a statement of power and prestige. Parades showcased gleaming uniforms, bayonets glinting in the sun, and artillery pieces rolling proudly through city streets. The message to the public was clear. The military was not merely a protector, it was the nation's pride. Germany, with its efficient general staff and cutting-edge weaponry, took particular pride in its army's readiness. Britain, separated by the English Channel, invested heavily in the Royal Navy, ensuring it could rule the waves unchallenged. France, still haunted by the Franco-Prussian War, yearned for military redemption. This arms race was as much about psychology as strategy. Nations felt they could not afford to appear weaker than their rivals. The more nations armed themselves, the more they assumed conflict was inevitable. Military leaders began to dominate political decisions, often overriding diplomats who sought compromise. Plans like Germany's Schlieffen Plan were drafted not as last resorts, but as blueprints waiting for the right excuse to be put into motion. The sword was always just inches from being drawn. In this climate, even a minor incident could be interpreted as an act of war. Soldiers were no longer just defenders. They were symbols of national honor. And when national honor was perceived to be at stake, diplomacy had little chance of survival. The spark in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled to Sarajevo. His visit was meant to showcase imperial authority in a region simmering with nationalist unrest. But among the crowd that lined the streets were members of the Black Hand, a secret Serbian nationalist group with deadly intentions. In their minds, removing the Archduke was a blow against the empire they despised. The first assassination attempt failed, a grenade bouncing off the Archduke's car and exploding behind it. Shaken, but determined to continue, Franz Ferdinand decided to visit the wounded in the hospital. It was during this detour that fate placed him directly in the path of Gavrilo Princip, one of the young conspirators. Princip fired 2 shots, one striking the Archduke, the other his wife, Sophie. The killings shocked Europe, but they were not unprecedented. Political assassinations had occurred before without sparking global war. What made Sarajevo different was the chain of diplomatic ultimatums, accusations, and mobilizations it unleashed. Austria-Hungary saw the murders not merely as a tragedy, but as an opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. In the weeks that followed, telegrams flew between capitals, threats and promises intertwining until the situation became irretrievable. What might have been a regional conflict was now set on a path toward a world war. The ultimatum to Serbia, Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia, was crafted to be rejected. The demands were sweeping: the right to investigate and prosecute Serbian officials, suppression of anti-Austrian propaganda, and more. Though couched in diplomatic language, the message was clear. Serbia was to submit or face war. The document's tone made compromise nearly impossible. Serbia, under Russian influence, accepted most demands, but balked at those that infringed on its sovereignty. The rejection was all Austria-Hungary needed to declare war. Russia, bound by its ties to Serbia, began mobilizing its forces. This triggered Germany's alliance obligations, and soon France and Britain were drawn into the unfolding crisis. The ultimatum had achieved its purpose: not peace, but war. Austria-Hungary believed it was striking a decisive blow, but in reality it had set in motion a conflict it could neither control nor survive. The Balkan powder keg ignites. The Balkans in 1912 and 1913 were a chessboard where every move threatened to tip the board entirely. The First and Second Balkan Wars had left the region bloodied and unstable, with borders redrawn almost as quickly as they were crossed. Serbia's growing power alarmed Austria-Hungary, whose leaders feared the rise of Slavic nationalism within their own empire. Every political meeting was shadowed by the possibility that a spark here could ignite the whole of Europe. Vienna and Belgrade's relations were already poisonous, each side seeing the other as a mortal threat. Serbian newspapers stoked nationalist fervor, while Austria-Hungary's government openly discussed ways to contain Serbia's ambitions. Russia stood as Serbia's silent protector, watching every Austrian move with suspicion. This tense triangle of alliances was like a coiled spring, waiting for the smallest pressure to snap. Diplomats struggled to cool tempers, but the street-level hatred was too deep. Anti-Austrian demonstrations in Belgrade spilled into violence, and in Vienna, politicians fanned fears of a Serbian-led revolt within their own Slavic provinces. The public in both nations seemed almost ready for war, their emotions outpacing reason. By 1914, the question was no longer if a crisis would erupt. It was when. In the eyes of the great powers, the Balkans were both too dangerous to ignore and too small to handle without brute force. Each intervention, each threat, each whispered promise of support only made the powder keg more volatile. The assassination in Sarajevo. June 28, 1914, dawned warm and bright in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived with his wife Sophie for what was meant to be a show of goodwill. Instead, their visit coincided with the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, a sacred date for Serbian nationalists. The city's streets hid more than just curious onlookers. Among the crowd, members of the Black Hand waited with pistols and bombs. The first attempt came early, when a grenade missed the Archduke's car and exploded under the next one, injuring officers and civilians. Shaken but determined, Franz Ferdinand continued the day's schedule. Fate, however, would give the assassins another chance. A wrong turn in the motorcade's route brought the Archduke's car face-to-face with Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old nationalist armed with a pistol. 2 shots rang out. Sophie was hit first, Franz Ferdinand second. Both died within minutes, their blood staining the seats of the open-top car. The city fell into chaos, and across Europe, governments held their breath, knowing this was more than a murder. It was the opening act of something far larger. News traveled fast, and in Vienna, grief quickly turned to rage. The assassination was painted as a direct attack by Serbia on the empire itself. Austria-Hungary began drafting demands that no sovereign nation could accept without humiliation, sealing the next step toward war. The July Crisis. In the weeks after Sarajevo, Europe became a stage where every major power played a dangerous game of posturing. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany's blank check of support, issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, 1914. Serbia's leaders were cornered. Rejecting the ultimatum meant war, but accepting it fully meant losing independence. They agreed to most points, but refused the ones that struck at their dignity. Behind the scenes, Russia moved to protect Serbia, mobilizing troops near the Austrian border. Germany, in turn, began its own mobilization, warning Russia to stand down. The July Crisis showed how a single event could pull an entire continent toward catastrophe. Every telegram, every declaration, every public statement tightened the noose around Europe's neck. The web of alliances tightens. Europe's alliance system had been built to prevent war. Yet in 1914, it was working like a machine designed for the opposite. The Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy faced off against the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. The death of the Archduke triggered the very scenario diplomats had feared, a local dispute pulling in all the great powers. Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia on July 28th set the gears turning. Russia's partial mobilization became full mobilization, leading Germany to declare war on Russia on August 1st. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France, following its long-prepared military plan. Britain, still hesitant, was pushed into action when Germany invaded Belgium. Each nation moved not just out of loyalty, but also fear. To stand aside meant risking isolation in a future war, and to move slowly meant giving enemies an advantage. In less than a week, Europe's capitals went from diplomatic correspondence to military orders. The war that leaders thought could be avoided now seemed inevitable, and the people, swept up in nationalism, cheered their armies into battle. The Schlieffen Plan in motion Germany's war strategy hinged on speed. The Schlieffen Plan called for a rapid invasion of France through neutral Belgium, knocking out one enemy before turning to face Russia. In theory, it would prevent a two-front war. In practice, it would ignite British outrage and deepen the conflict. On August 4th, German troops crossed into Belgium, meeting fierce resistance from both the Belgian army and civilian fighters. The bravery of the defenders slowed the German advance just enough to give France and Britain time to organize. The plan's designers had underestimated not only Belgian resistance, but also the logistical nightmare of moving vast armies through hostile territory. Railways were sabotaged, bridges destroyed, and every delay meant the Russian army had more time to mobilize in the east. The world joins the fight. Within months, what had started as a European conflict began to pull in nations across the globe. Japan entered the war on the side of the Allies, seeking to expand its influence in Asia. The Ottoman Empire, after initial hesitation, sided with the Central Powers, bringing new fronts into the Middle East and the Caucasus. Colonies across Africa and Asia became battlefields, as European powers fought not only in Europe, but also for control of overseas territories. Soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, and Africa were shipped thousands of miles to fight in a war far from their homelands. By late 1914, it was clear that this was not a regional war. It was a world war. And it was only beginning. The death of illusions. When the war began, many believed it would be over by Christmas. Soldiers marched to the front with songs on their lips, thinking of glory and adventure. By the end of 1914, the reality was trenches, mud, and the stench of death. The Western Front had become a stalemate, with neither side able to break through despite massive casualties. Machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire turned open fields into killing grounds. In capitals across Europe, leaders faced the sobering truth. They had unleashed a conflict far greater than any had imagined. World War I was no longer a war of choice. It had become a war of survival. And the question of what really caused World War I now had an answer. A tangle of ambition, fear, alliances, and human miscalculation that had led the world into darkness. And so, as we close this 600-minute journey into the tangled roots of the Great War, one thing becomes clear. World War I was never the result of a single bullet, a single assassin, or a single moment in Sarajevo. In the end, millions died, empires fell, and borders were redrawn. But the deeper causes of the war remained etched in the lessons history keeps trying to teach us. As you reflect on what we've explored, ask yourself, are the forces that led to 1914 really gone? Or do they still lurk beneath the surface of our modern world, disguised but ready to ignite again? The story of World War I is not just history. It's a warning about pride, power, and the fragile peace that can shatter in a single moment.